The Making of the Group by Pauline Kael. Published in the summer 1966 issue of Partisan Review, reprinted in Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Those who get disgusted with American movies may often be heard asking why America isn't producing great film directors, as if we had a shortage of talent, as if artists were yet to be attracted to the medium. The more relevant question might be, does the American film industry foster mediocrity and make it almost impossible for artists to work? What kind of people get to make movies, and what gives a movie its particular shape? I hoped to find some possible answers by observing how Mary McCarthy's novel The Group became the movie The Group. The package. By August 28, 1963, when the novel was published, every major American motion picture studio had considered it and turned it down. Charles K. Feldman, an agent turned independent packager of movie properties, a function sometimes described as executive producer, bought it for $162,500, partly in deferred payments, plus 10% of the distributor's gross after the break-even point, and proceeded to try to convince the companies that had already rejected the book to finance the production. The group had just reached the bookstores. Feldman hired publicity men to promote it. In addition to the publisher's advertising expenditures, he says he put $50,000 into advertising in the United States, $12,000 in England, and sizable amounts into other countries where the novel was coming out in translation. He claims that it was his money that made the book a bestseller. Several reasonably disinterested publishers I have talked with say that the group would have made it without Feldman's money, though it may have helped in keeping the book so high on the lists for so long. Feldman's principal aim was to increase the value of his property so that he could make an advantageous deal with one of the studios. They would need convincing, of course, that the book, which they had not thought would make a movie, could be made into a movie. On the Riviera, he arranged with Sidney Buchman, a veteran Hollywood writer, to adapt the book and serve as producer. Long ago, when Buchman had been head of production at Columbia, Feldman had been his agent. Now, Feldman hired Buchman for $180,000 plus a percentage. Buchman is almost a one-man history of Hollywood. His first screenplay was for Cecil B. DeMille's The Sign of the Cross in 1932. His credits as co-writer or writer include such diverse films as If I Had a Million, Theodore Goes Wild, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Holiday, Here Comes Mr. Jordan, Talk of the Town, Jolson Sings Again, and A Song to Remember. Buchman's career fell apart during the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings. He went abroad, made his home at Cannes, and, except for the 1961 English film The Mark, which he produced and co-authored, and perhaps a little bootleg job here or there, he was out of work, in a gentlemanly, comfortable way, for 15 years. He was 63 when he took on the labor of the group, a very tired and cynical 63, and yet, curiously enough, determined to turn this new movie into some kind of progressive statement. It might be asked at this point, why didn't Mary McCarthy adopt her own material for the screen? On the first page of her first book, she had used an analogy with movies to describe her writing process, and her fiction, which is reportorial and semi-autobiographical, is peculiarly cinematic. She records characters and relationships from the outside, and she details the costumes, furnishings, and locations that give the actions specific meanings. Is there a more completely worked-out scenario in modern fiction than The Man in the Brooks Brothers shirt? It's already a movie. However, there is no indication that she was asked to work on the group. She told Feldman that she didn't think the novel could work as a movie without a lot of invention. But Buckman stayed very close to the book, hardly even inventing any dialogue, although transposing characters' thoughts into speech. She had not asked to see the screenplay. Buckman sent her a copy. She did not comment on it. Perhaps his fidelity to her material did not please her any more than infidelity might have. She is notoriously a writer given to seeing the faults in any course of action. And in this case, it was obvious that neither inventiveness nor fidelity could be completely satisfactory. There were huge structural gaps in the book that, in dramatic terms, and in terms of fiction also, cried out for invention. Yet Bachman must have known that he could not invent in her style. He played it safe, preferring narrative holes to inadequate invention. This was not exactly pleasing to Feldman, who admits publicly that he has no interest in Mary McCarthy's stature as a writer. Feldman's enthusiasm for the property had little to do with the literary qualities or dramatic potential of Miss McCarthy's work, but on the gorgeous possibility of getting options on a group of inexpensive, luscious young nobodies, building them up into stars, and then having them available for his own films and for handsome loan-out deals. He had had a similar intention when he bought What's New Pussycat, which he had also intended to cast with unknowns and little-knowns. But somehow things got out of hand in the way movie financing casting, a peculiarly linked process, often does, and he had wound up with Peter O'Toole, Peter Sellers, Capuccine, Ursula Andress, Romy Schneider, and Paula Prentice. This time, with a property featuring 8 young girls, surely he would get his own young Capucines and Andresses, and with a stable of young beauties under option, a modern movie packager-producer could be richer than the greatest whoremasters of history. There are even directors in Hollywood who make more money from the pieces they own of the stars they give their first break to than from directing. Feldman's ideas of casting are rather basic. You can always teach them to act. He was so confident that this time he would get cheap stars out of the deal that when Buckman had completed a draft of the screenplay and United Artists became interested, he stipulated as part of the deal that UA should spend at least $100,000 to exploit the new talent, which he assumed would be his new talent. There was another special interest that Feldman had in the book, a chance to exploit a lesbian theme. He assumed that the screenplay would center on Lakey's affairs, which would, of course, have to be invented for her. Instead, Buckman held so close to the text that waiting for Lakey to reappear in the movie is about like waiting for Godot. And the whole lesbian theme was handled with such discretion that when the movie was finished, the United Artists publicity men threw out the campaign they had prepared to exploit it and prepared a new campaign featuring a True Confessions approach to each of the girls. At the point when the deal was made, Charles K. Feldman became the man in the background, and Sidney Buckman, more or less in charge of the production, began looking for a director. Most of the men interviewed were television directors who had never made a movie. This partly explains why recent movies are so bad. There is almost no way for young movie directors to get experience or make a reputation except on television, which is very different from movie making, although movie making is now becoming like television, or in the theater, which is even more different. But the older movie directors are dying off or are priced out of the market. They work on huge, slow super epics. So, for a production like this, TV and stage directors are considered and may get their first movie experience. Negotiations and discussions were going on with these men when Sidney Lumet, who has the same agent as Buckman, saw the script and leaped at the job. Lumet had not read the novel. It's doubtful if he's ever read any Mary McCarthy. What he leaped at, evidently, was Sidney Buckman's screenplay, a job that would pay him $125,000, and a movie with a longer shooting schedule and a larger budget than he had ever had. Why were they about to start on the cumbersome, tedious process of making a movie out of this novel? Why were they going to all the trouble of construction and reproduction to tell a story that had already been told in a simple, efficient, inexpensive way? Sometimes there are people who really want to bring their vision of a particular novel to life. But the filming of The Group was strictly a business proposition. Yet it presented aesthetic problems. In theory, there is little that a novel can do that a movie can't. But practically, American audiences won't sit for the length and detail and complexity of a novel. Almost all the details in this novel, the fads and fashions and chit-chat, could be dramatically rendered, but how would the movie recreate the political climate, the sexual morality, the decor of the 30s, the so recent past, for the large movie audience? Much distortion and simplification was inevitable. Perhaps even more was accidental. Sidney Lumet had been getting work directing movies for several years because he was cheap, fast, and reliable. But when he signed for The Group, he had still never had a box office hit. And the people who put movie packages together are more concerned with box office results than with the quality of the films. Lumet was known to critics and perhaps to the art house audience for his first movie, the one-set, low-budget 12 Angry Men, which, despite critical enthusiasm, hasn't shown a profit. The literate, uneven stage struck, the spectacular artistic and commercial disaster, the Brando Magnani, The Fugitive Kind, the ambitious and financially unsuccessful A View from the Bridge, and the superb transcription of O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, which had cost less than $500,000 and still lost money. He had been making some of the most interesting movies coming out of the United States, but without at least one winner, he had no standing in the world of big movies, big profits. He was part of that earlier television into movies new generation of directors. But two other members of that generation, John Frankenheimer and Martin Ritt, had already made it into the big time with hits, and he was still in the young promising category, that is, hustling, taking the quick jobs, like Failsafe, that bigger directors didn't want. He could get these jobs because of his reputation for staying within budget and maybe even finishing ahead of schedule. Lumet wanted to work, and he liked to work fast. He would not try to reshape the scenario or risk holding up production to do something unscheduled. He wouldn't plead for a few extra days to get something right. If a director in another country had succeeded financially with an unusual project or approach, he is acclaimed as an artist, and the big American companies are anxious to get him. But if a young American director shows any traces of really caring about what he does or how he does it, any signs of artistry, they become uneasy and clamp down on him. Art means risks to businessmen. Taking risks is unprofessional behavior. But by the time a man has made a TV reputation, he knows the score, and there's very little he has left of his own to express. He has become a mechanic, and he'll approach making a movie as a job promotion, a step up from television. Businessmen want directors they can trust on the basis of past performance, and this, ironically, may be one of the reasons so many small pictures lose money. Lumet was television trained. That meant he would do things the obvious ways that producers don't worry about. Or if he did give them something to worry about, at least it would be something they could understand. And even without any hits on his record, Lumet was trustworthy because, for example, He never considered it a deterrent factor that, when he read the novel, he hated it. He was no dangerous artist. He was out to do a job. Sidney Lumet's background was about as far from Mary McCarthy's Vassar as you can get. The son of an actor from Poland who appeared in the Yiddish theater in New York, the elder Lumet appears as Mr. Scheidt in the group. He had himself been an infant actor. Indeed, the infant Jesus in Max Reinhardt's New York production of The Eternal Road. He was Christ again as a boy in Maxwell Anderson's Journey to Jerusalem, with Arlene Francis as Mary. He was understudy to one of the dead-end kids on Broadway, and it is not perhaps stretching the point to suggest that both of these roles are still visible in his behavior. He's messianic and driven, but like an understudy to a dead-end kid, he's in a hurry to get there. Lumet, in the conventional sense, is probably not very well educated. But, in a way, untutored high intelligence may make a person seem even more creative, as if it came out of nowhere. And in show business, people love the idea of genius. It's so much easier to throw the term about than to try to explain why certain people manage to get somewhere. Lumet, despite his almost ostentatious show business street boy's manner, is very well self-educated in terms of what he may be able to use. He reads for a purpose. A standard complaint of his earlier producers is, Sidney doesn't listen. But he hears what he wants to, not what they want him to. In conversation, he doesn't respond to what doesn't immediately relate to his own interests. So the subject changes, or he simply changes it, as he is likely to be the dominating force anyway. He seems to have almost no intellectual curiosity of a more generalized or objective nature. Working on the group, Lumet was not scholarly, to put it mildly, about Mary McCarthy or about Vassar, but as a lifelong actor and an experienced TV and movie director, he showed a professional respect for acting and his job. He and Buckman did the casting together, and, with the exceptions of Candice Bergen, a beauty glorious and young enough to gladden Feldman's and anyone else's heart, they selected for talent. Candy Bergen was hardly a poor struggling unknown who could be signed up for peanuts and promises and tied up for years of servitude. And the two Sidneys moved so fast in casting and getting underway that by the time Feldman's minions, uncertain and apprehensive about whether Feldman would want the other girls, actresses, and which of them, got around to framing agreements, the girls were already in the picture and didn't need to sign away their futures in order to get this chance. The casting. The casting of movies is in some ways more important than the casting of plays. In the theater, a competent actor can make in many roles his own, but in movies, what an actor knows and can do is often less important than what he simply physically is. The way he looks, how he photographs, what he inadvertently projects. On stage, he may be able to become a whole gallery of characters, but the camera exposes the actor as a man of a certain age, with definite physical assets and liabilities. There he is in a close-up, huge on the screen, and if he's trying to play something that is physically different from what he is, he looks like a fool, and only if he is a good and subtle actor can he play something that is psychologically very different from how he is. When a movie is derived from a popular novel, the casting is even more complex. The roles have not been written with certain actors in mind. Rather, the actors must somehow fit into the novelist's conception, or at least into a conception the public will accept as a reasonable facsimile. At best, in popular commercial movies, they should be like illustrations to the text, whose cover they will probably adorn in the paperback edition that is timed to the release of the film. or so popular in themselves that they will be stronger than the images in the text. All that was obvious from the outside. I knew it as a critic. These were simply the facts of the situation. But sitting in a little office with the producer and director as they interviewed actors and then discussed them, there were factors I had never really considered as a critic. Everybody knows and talks about the state of the theater. We all know there are few jobs, except in TV, which is now almost all in California. But here was the living evidence: actors trying to get a job. Budgeted at $2,600,000, The Group was the most expensive movie yet made in New York. There were a lot of parts in it, and perhaps half the out-of-work actors in New York at one time or another must have had hopes. As each actor or actress came in for the prearranged interview, the air in the little room was heavy with strain and embarrassment. Many of them had worked with Lumet in his early days in the theater or in radio, or had been directed by him in early live TV. So there were tentative reminders of past association, uneasy good wishes to be conveyed to his father, an uncertainty about how far to press old intimacies with their former associate, now in a job-giving capacity. Powerlessness made them uncertain of how to deal with power. Desperation made them transparent. The women in turbans or big, tricky hats all seemed to apologize for their hair. One after another explained how their agents had just notified them of the interview. Asked their height, most of the men gave the all-purpose 5'11", wanting to be considered neither too short nor too tall for whatever the role might be. In fear of being considered wrong and not knowing what they were being considered for, they tried to pass themselves off as everyman. They had been preceded, of course, by photographs, large, glossy, glamorous photographs sent in by agents, and as Lumet said, "What's heartbreaking is the pictures versus the people." We saw them as they had looked, or could look, or had been doctored to look, and then we saw them. It was like people on TV commercials versus people in subways. And I was horrified because they were people I knew. I had seen them in my childhood in the theater in San Francisco. I had seen them touring with Catherine Cornell or acting in New York hits. I had seen them long ago in the movies as juvenile leads or in character roles. Almost all of them were familiar names in the theater, people I thought of as established, secure, honored. And here they were trying to get bit parts, eager for a few days' work for a 2-line role, and not knowing whether to conceal their desperation or whether to expose it. You could see them trying to calculate how much front they should put on, or whether a naked appeal would be preferable. And they spoke in voices I knew so well, the voices that seemed to belong to their past more than to their present. Some of those familiar faces were aged, others just burnt out. I think the worst thing to watch, because it was the most human really, was when they tried uncertainly to play it both ways, to conceal what shape they were in, and yet somehow to appeal. In succession, each applicant threw illumination on the others. It became like some terrible TV show, in which the great, the famous, the celebrated expose their wrecked careers, their shameful poverty, the knowledge that they're drifting, waiting for a break, and maybe this show is it. It's as if they never had the breaks, never been famous, because now they scarcely expect to be remembered. Too many people have obviously forgotten them. They know how little it means in terms of getting jobs, that they were once stars or almost stars, that they're well known. Why do producers and directors begin to play God? Because they do play God. I had only a couple of weeks of observing the casting in May. It had been going on since late February. They had looked over 200 promising young actresses for the 8 leads. I didn't even want to think about what their pitches must have been like, how eager they must have been for a chance to make their names, change their fortunes. How cool they must have tried to appear, perhaps almost as cool as those who got the jobs, and then tried to appear indifferent to them. If one believed what they told the papers, several of the girls in the picture really didn't know why they bothered doing it at all. I found 2 weeks of it hard to take, like living in a butcher shop with human meat. I had heard plenty of descriptions from actor friends, but I had never seen it from the other side. The casting director had selected the candidates for the meager little roles being cast, mothers or fathers of the girls of the group, a butler, friends, roles that were later cut or reduced to a glimpse anyway. And so, sometimes, it went to the actor who had exposed his need more, and then I couldn't help thinking, suppose the other one, who came on so prosperous and pleasant, was really even more desperate and too proud to show it. Most of the middle-aged performers were being considered for the parent roles, and unfortunately those who did not get the parts could not know, and probably they wouldn't have believed even if they were told, that they weren't picked because they didn't match up right with their daughters. After a lifetime in the theater, they were being picked not for what they could play, but for their physical types and for chance resemblances. And those who did get these small parts were of course really too good for the roles, which required almost no acting, and whenever they had a line, they gave it so much full-throated voice and elegant gesture and presence that the lines generally had to be cut, because all that acting was florid and stagey and ridiculous. They were trying to turn movie bits into rich roles, and the results were generally disastrous. Non-professionals typecast might have done as well or better, but then non-professionals probably wouldn't have needed the work so much. What sustained these people, in the most delusionary of all careers, acting? There is a great deal written about the rich fantasy life and role-playing in the childhood of actors, but actors may have nothing else to sustain them later on either. Why do they stick with it? Many don't, of course, and I was to meet them shortly. They were the crew, from the director on down. They were almost all actors who had given up. The planning. Under modern production conditions, the key figures in movie making, who on this film were the producer, writer, and the director, are businessmen who claim the prestige and the latitude of the genius artist role. Buckman and Lumet were already negotiating for their next projects when this one actually got underway. The crucial work for them seemed to be finished before the shooting started. The deal and the planning of the production, which, like running a war, involves an almost incredible amount of detail, ledgers full of plans and calculations, including everything from transporting and feeding the actresses to having 30 cars ready at a certain place at a certain date. Like other businessmen, they were already planning their winter line while turning out the summer product. Buckman said he could hardly wait for this to be over so he could get on to some real work. Eager to get back into his old harness, he was working on a Howard Fast novel. Lumet, while hoping to line up something that really excited him, the production of a John Hersey novel, was planning his next job, a John le Carre spy thriller. But, though priding themselves on being good businessmen, which in movie business is what is usually meant by professionalism, they did not necessarily recognize how completely they were businessmen, perhaps because they felt that they really believed, if not in this project, at least in those future hoped-for Howard Fast and John Hersey projects. For Lumet, planning includes the camera position for each shot, the lens to be used, and just about everything the technicians need to know. The camera will rarely move within a shot. Movement will be accomplished by the actors moving within the frame and by the rapid juxtaposition of shots. During the actual shooting, the director puts the actors through their paces, trying to get some sense of life, mainly by encouraging the actors to come on strong, into his mechanized plan. The director who has enough training and self-confidence to face an army of technicians and experiment or improvise is rare. And what company wants him if his methods lose time, which is money? Tough, bright men like Sidney Lumet can get their effects not by what we used to think of as the movie director's art, but by turning on, that is, turning loose the actors, and by emphasizing certain powerful big scenes, emphatic climaxes, shocks, excessive and thus surprising bits of action. Lumet is not so vulgar as most of the new television-trained movie directors, who just keep the actors shouting in close-up. And, unlike the pretentious ones among them, he knows that he is just shooting a script, that he is not discovering the possibilities in the material and shaping it. Nevertheless, he enthusiastically invited me to observe how the crew would begin to intermesh as the shooting went on, and talked often of the rhythm that the footage would reveal when it was edited. After observing a few days of shooting, I knew that if the editing would reveal rhythm in the footage, it would be luck, and luck was only likely in bits of sequences. It couldn't be counted on for the total structure. There are movie directors who try to plan out every detail in advance. Hitchcock, for example, conceives the movie visually from the beginning of the script preparation, designing the production like a complicated mousetrap, then building it. His script is a set of plans representing the completed film, including the editing, and if he doesn't need to depart from it, that is because he works for exactly calculated effects of suspense and perversity. He is an ingenious, masterly builder of mousetraps, and more often than not the audience is caught tight. His techniques, however, probably have more to do with gamesmanship than with art, and they are almost the opposite of the working methods of most great directors, for whom making the movie is itself a process of discovery. That process of discovery is not part of studio movie making. In Hollywood, even Jean Renoir, whose greatest work has been free and improvisatory, was expected to stick to plan, and his American movies showed what happens to an artist in such conditions. If a director is forced to follow a plan, whether another's or even his own, when at the time of shooting he wants to do it some other way, to use an idea that occurs to him when he sees the actors together on the set, or sees the possibility of using the landscape in a way he hadn't thought of before, the necessity to do it according to specifications is crippling. It means he can't use his wits. He can't be spontaneous or inventive. He can't think and feel as an artist. This is one of the business practices that makes hacks out of American directors. And if the director knows that his being in a position to make movies at all is dependent on sticking to plan, probably after a while he doesn't even think of how he might like to do it. He just does it. These are the men who, in Hollywood, are considered the true pros. From what I observed, Lumet's planning is based on the hope that he'll come out of the shooting with something he can pull together in the editing room. The precision of his method is illusory. Mechanically, the shots are neatly scheduled, but their precise effect in terms of the finished film is not calculated. When he can't match them up properly later, when the rhythm isn't revealed, audiences may experience the confusion of not knowing how to react to the action. For example, passages of comedy in the group were often so awkward when assembled that some audiences thought the humor was inadvertent. That tight schedule looks very businesslike on paper. Everything seems to be worked out. But when you watch the shooting, as later when you watch the rushes, and finally when you see the movie, you know he operates on a wing and a prayer, and not just in an emergency, but every day. For sheer guts, Lumet is awe-inspiring. The novel. Lumet and Buckman had finished their thinking about the group. Their minds were already turning on the future. At one level, I was more interested in this film than they were, at the level of what it was all about, how they were interpreting the novel. Except for conversations in which I brought up this subject, I never heard it discussed during the production, nor did anyone ever talk about Mary McCarthy. Some of the girls, and their stand-ins too, were reading the group during their waiting time at rehearsals. I could not tell whether for the first time. I did not ask because, after some early conversations with Lumet, he requested that I not discuss the author or novel with the actresses, and I held to this religiously. This was astute of him. He sensed some danger in my questioning his interpretations, not only with him but with them. The remarks that I had made, which led to this restriction, were during a discussion with him in which I had demurred from Buckman's view of Mary McCarthy, and referred to her autobiographical Memories of a Catholic Girlhood. Lumet did not know the book. Whenever the subject of the movie came up among the girls or among the crew, it was usually referred to contemptuously as a soap opera, which I gradually came to understand meant not only that they didn't see more to the novel than soap opera, but that was how they referred to something when they felt superior to it, when they considered it commercial rather than artistic. Was it possible that no one around had any notion of Mary McCarthy's position in the literary world? She was not only a writer, she was a culture heroine, with pride in intelligence and wit that cleaned away commonplaces. She was direct, a liberator who brought women's experience out in the open. But her smartness carried a threat to conventionality, and she was often penalized for it. Time had expressed what so many felt, that Mary McCarthy is, quote, quite possibly the cleverest woman America has ever produced, end quote. This made her a favorite voodoo doll. Anyone who wanted to prove his superiority jabbed at her, and indeed Time did it with the needle of cleverest, which, though accurate, is also wounding. Clever so often means merely clever, not profound or truly important, certainly not sincere. In the 20-odd years since the publication of The Man in the Brooks Brothers shirt, she was frequently jabbed in the wrong places by the sort of people who say, "So she got laid on a train, does she have to tell about it?" as if she had violated the gentleman's code. Those who don't believe in the single standard have no qualms about using it to reinforce their double standard. No one around the movie seemed to connect to this Mary McCarthy, or to be aware of how the publication of the group had altered her position, puzzling her longtime admirers, and bringing her a different, bestseller audience. In the group, she parodies the motives, the aspirations, the styles, and ideas of a group of girls who graduated from Vassar in 1933 into the midst of the Depression and the New Deal. Her Vassar girls seemed to be the women as victims, so dearly beloved of middle-class fiction. Aggressive, determined Kay. Kay was a frightful dancer and always tried to lead. Goes mad. Good sweet Polly gets a dear understanding husband to depend on. It was like a Hollywood movie. The girl who wants too much gets nothing, is destroyed. The girl waiting for the right man gets the best of everything. She wins an undogmatic psychiatrist, the same role so often filled in movies by a forward-looking architect. This Prince Charming even sets up a test that she wouldn't send her loony papa to an institution. It seemed as if the group could almost have been written by a female equivalent of The Man in the Brooks Brothers shirt. Mary McCarthy's attitude to her characters had become embarrassingly like his, from his disapproval of the heroine's suitcase with a missing handle to his final plea. Forget all this red nonsense, and remember that you're just your father's little girl at heart. Her earlier troublemaker heroine had split into Impossible Kay and Ludicrous Libby, and father's little girl at heart, Polly, had now become the heroine. Although pieces of the novel had appeared in print almost a decade before book publication, the direction it took was a surprise, and many of her former admirers thought the girls of the group as cold and calculating, and as irrational and defenseless and inept as if conceived by an anti-feminist male writer. It was depressing to find the book praised by those who thought it showed what happened to girls who insist on meeting life free from parental protection or guidance, as if a Victorian training in domestic skills might have equipped them better than their Vassar education and kept them home and out of trouble. This way of reading the book, though naive, was common, and it was the usual bestseller Hollywood view of women. And this view, mixed with the idea that it was also a sensational book, dirty in places, seemed to be prevalent around the studio. To be continued.